The night was dark, filled with the weight of desperate decisions. Lian Zhe, a young woman from a poor family, sat by the window, her eyes filled with silent tears. Her mother lay ill in the hospital, battling a disease they couldn't afford to treat. Lian Zhe had tried everything, selling belongings, borrowing money, but nothing was enough. The weight of the world seemed to fall on her fragile shoulders as she struggled to find a way to save the one person who meant everything to her. Desperation drove her to a choice she never thought she'd have to make. An anonymous offer had come to her, a wealthy businessman, someone who could pay for her mother's treatment if she could just sacrifice one night. The offer felt wrong, yet Lian Zhe, with no other options, felt trapped. The thought of her mother suffering while she stood helpless was too much to bear, and so, in a moment of utter despair, she agreed. What Lian Zhe didn't know was that the man she'd sold her first night to wasn't just any stranger. He was Li Yuchen, the powerful CEO of the most successful corporation in the city. Cold, calculating, and seemingly indifferent to the world around him, Li Yuchen had everything, except for love. His life, consumed by business deals and power plays, had left him isolated, yearning for something real. But what would happen when he found something unexpected? The night she arrived at the lavish hotel, Lian Zhe's heart pounded. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the thought of saving her mother gave her the strength to go through with it. She stood in front of the door, her heart racing, unsure of what would happen once she stepped inside. What could a man like him want from someone like her? She wasn't even sure she could look him in the eye when the time came, but she had to do it. Her mother's life depended on it. On the other side of the door, Li Yuchen sat, watching the scene unfold from a hidden camera. He had known exactly who she was the moment she walked in. He had been keeping an eye on her, intrigued by the quiet strength in her eyes, her unspoken determination. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved with someone like her. He wasn't the kind of man to feel anything at all. Yet, as he watched her prepare to give up everything for the sake of her mother, something stirred within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. But it wasn't just sympathy or pity. There was something more. He found himself drawn to her, not just as a subject of his curiosity, but as someone he felt a deep, inexplicable connection to. He had seen many women in his life, but none like Lian Zhe, and the more he watched, the more he felt the pull of something beyond mere attraction. As the door opened, Lian Zhe stepped into the room, her nerves on edge. The atmosphere felt heavy, the air thick with uncertainty. She was ready to face the unknown, ready to do whatever it took to save her mother. But what she didn't expect was the man standing before her. His sharp, dark eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her choice. Li Yuchen didn't speak immediately. Instead, he watched her closely, sensing the raw vulnerability behind her brave facade. There was something about her that made him pause. Something real, something human in a world where everything else seemed fake. And as he stood there, observing her, he realized something he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just a businessman about to make a deal. He was a man, and he wanted to know her. But just as quickly as the moment started, it was over. Li Yuchen, the man who could control anything, with a mere gesture, suddenly found himself at a loss for words. He didn't know what he expected from this encounter, but it certainly wasn't the complex emotions swirling inside him. For the first time, he wasn't sure about his next move, and Lian Zhe, she wasn't prepared for what came next. She had made her choice to save her mother, but what she didn't know was that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. The CEO, the man she thought she was just selling herself to, had seen her in a light no one else ever had. But now, He wanted something more than just a fleeting transaction. He wanted to get to know her, to understand her. And that was the last thing Lian Jie could have anticipated. The night ended in a blur of confusion, emotions, and unspoken tension. As Lian Jie left the hotel room, she felt the weight of what had just happened. She had saved her mother, at least for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her decision had set something into motion. Li Yuchen's presence loomed in her mind. There was a tension, a pull between them that she couldn't explain, and it made her question everything. What would happen next? Would Li Yuchen seek her out? Would he try to make her life even more complicated than it already was? And most importantly, how would she navigate the feelings that had begun to stir within her? Could she really keep her distance from the man who had already seen her at her most vulnerable? And as for Li Yuchen, would he let this woman, who had so easily slipped through his control, slip away from his life without a second thought? Or was he about to go after her, determined to have her in ways he had never imagined? The story was far from over. What started as a desperate choice to save a mother was about to unravel into a complicated web of emotions, power, and love that neither of them were prepared for. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is just beginning. Days passed since that fateful night, and life for Lian Jie returned to its fragile normalcy. Her mother's health was stable now, thanks to the money she had received in exchange for her sacrifice. The doctors had said that with the proper care, her mother could make a full recovery, but the weight of what she had done still sat heavy on Lian Jie's shoulders. Gnawing at her every waking moment, she had convinced herself it was for the right reasons. After all, saving her mother's life had to come first, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. Had she made a deal with the devil? And why did Li Yuchen's eyes linger in her thoughts, even when she tried to push him out? Li Yuchen, on the other hand, was caught in a whirlwind of his own. The days after that night were nothing like the control he was used to. He ran his empire with precision, every move calculated, every decision made with an unwavering certainty. But the events that unfolded between him and Lian Jie had left him unsettled. Her vulnerability, the quiet strength in her eyes, her willingness to sacrifice for her mother, they had all struck a chord deep within him. And it confused him. He was the kind of man who controlled everything in his life, but this woman, this seemingly ordinary girl, had slipped past all his defenses. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the way she had looked at him with fear, yet without judgment. What troubled him more was his growing obsession with the idea of her. He found himself tracking her. Nothing too extreme, just subtle glances at her life, the way she carried herself, how she seemed to move through the world with a quiet grace. And it gnawed at him. The sense that she was someone worth knowing, but she was out of reach. She had already given herself to him in the way she thought she had to, but there was no real connection between them. He had nothing to offer but his wealth and power, and Lian Jie wasn't someone who could be bought. That much was clear. It wasn't long before Li Yuchen found himself making excuses to see her. He told himself it was for business, that he needed to make sure she understood the gravity of the situation, that he could help her in ways that didn't involve strings attached. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. His interest in her went far beyond charity. He wanted to see the woman behind the choice she had made, and so he reached out, carefully at first, with an invitation to meet under the guise of business. He would offer her a sum of money for her silence, a gesture to ensure no one would ever find out about their meeting. Lian Jie, however, was not the kind of woman to be swayed by money. She had already done the unthinkable for the sake of her family, and she didn't need charity from anyone, especially not from someone like Li Yuchen. She was proud of her sacrifices. even if they were painful. And the thought of him looking at her like a mere transaction was unbearable, but the invitation was impossible to ignore. What if he had another proposition for her? What if this time he would offer something more, something that could change her life forever? She struggled with the decision. Her pride told her to stay away, to move on with her life, and never look back. But there was also a part of her that was curious. Curious about this man who had watched her, who had seen her in her most vulnerable moment, and who hadn't judged her, for reasons she couldn't explain. The idea of seeing him again, of facing him without the shadow of desperation hanging over her, was tempting. And so, with reluctance, she agreed. She met him at one of the city's most luxurious restaurants, a place where the rich and powerful came to flaunt their wealth. The opulence of the setting only made her feel more out of place, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to make another decision she might regret. Li Yuchen was already waiting when she arrived, dressed in his usual immaculate suit, exuding an air of power that made her feel small. But when their eyes met, something flickered between them, an unspoken recognition of the shared history they now had. The tension was palpable, yet neither of them knew how to break the silence. "I didn't expect you to come," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't place. "I wasn't sure if I should," she replied, her gaze unwavering. For a moment, they both sat in silence, unsure of what to say. But then, slowly, Li Yuchen leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, his tone softer than she had ever heard. "More than I should." Lianji's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that. But before she could respond, a sudden realization hit her. The same man who had offered her money to remain silent, who had watched her from behind the shadows, was now confessing that he couldn't stop thinking about her. He wasn't just offering her a handout. He was offering something more. The question was, did she even want what he had to offer? As they talked, the conversation drifted from small talk to deeper subjects, and the connection between them grew undeniable. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in despite herself. But Lianji couldn't forget the reason she was sitting there in the first place. Her mother's treatment, her family, everything she had sacrificed for them. Was it worth it? Was she willing to risk her heart, her life, for a man she barely knew, but who had already turned her world upside down? Li Yuchen, for his part, was equally conflicted. He had never wanted anyone like this before. He had always been able to control the situation, to dictate the terms of every relationship he had. But Lianji was different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or power. She didn't look at him like everyone else did, with admiration or fear. She saw him as he was, as just a man. And that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. But with each passing moment, Li Yuchen knew he was crossing a line. He couldn't just pull her into his world of power and influence without consequences. And if he wanted to keep her in his life, he'd have to show her he was more than just the cold CEO who had bought her silence. As the evening ended, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were both caught in a web of their own making, and the question now was whether they could untangle it without destroying each other in the process. But as Lianji walked away from him that night, a chilling thought ran through her mind. What if Li Yuchen wasn't the one she should be worried about? What if the true threat was something closer to home? Something that could tear her family apart? Her life was about to get even more complicated, and she had no idea how much danger she was truly in. The next few days were a blur for Lianji. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life was about to change, but she couldn't quite grasp how or why. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Li Yuchen's face, his eyes so intense, so searching, as if he was trying to figure out a puzzle that didn't have an easy solution. But as much as he intrigued her, there was still that nagging question in the back of her mind. What did he really want from her? Then, the phone call came. It was her mother's doctor, calling to update her on the treatment. The moment she heard the news, her heart skipped a beat. Her mother's condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. There had been complications, and the chances of recovery were no longer as high as they once were. Lianjie was desperate. She had already sacrificed so much for her mother's health, but it felt like fate was mocking her. Everything she had done, selling herself, giving up her pride, had been for nothing. The thought of losing her mother was too much to bear. Lianjie felt the walls closing in, but she knew there was no time to waste. She had to do something, and quickly. But what? That was when Li Yuchen appeared again. He showed up at her door, uninvited, but with an air of quiet determination. His usual composed demeanor was replaced with something more personal, something almost vulnerable. "I know what you're going through," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I want to help you, not as a business transaction, but as someone who cares." Lianjie stared at him, her emotions a chaotic mess. She wanted to scream at him, to push him away. She had already given so much, sacrificed so much, and now here he was, offering her more help, more of his money, but something about the sincerity in his eyes made her pause. Was he telling the truth? Could she trust him? Before she could respond, Li Yuchen spoke again, his words catching her off guard. "I know this is hard for you, but I want to be clear. What happened that night? It wasn't just a transaction for me. I saw something in you, something I want to understand. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right for you and your family." Lianjie felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never heard him speak like this before. This wasn't the powerful CEO who controlled everything with money. This was a man, vulnerable and open, offering her something real. She had no idea why he felt this way about her. But there was a part of her that couldn't deny the pull between them. But there was still so much uncertainty. "You're offering me everything you have. But it's not just money I need. I need my mother's life back. I need to make sure she doesn't slip away from me," she said, her voice cracking. Li Yuchen stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I can't promise your mother's recovery, but I can promise you one thing. I won't let you face this alone. I will help you in every way I can. You've already done so much for your family. Let me do something for you." In that moment, everything clicked into place for Lianjie. She realized that what she truly needed wasn't just money or resources. It was someone who cared enough to fight with her, who was willing to stand by her side. And while Li Yuchen had started out as a stranger, someone who had bought her silence, he was now offering her something far more valuable: his support, his presence, and the possibility of something real between them. But just as she was about to let herself believe in this new path, a loud knock at the door interrupted them. Lianjie's heart sank as she opened it, only to find someone she never expected. It was her estranged father, a man who had walked out on their family years ago, leaving them to struggle on their own. He looked disheveled, desperate, and there was an unfamiliar woman standing beside him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Lianjie asked, her voice shaky. Her father didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, his eyes meeting Li Yuchen's. "I need your help," he said, his voice low. "My business is failing, and I'm in debt. I need money, and I don't know where else to turn." Lianjie felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. Her father had never been there for her, and now he was asking for help. Not just from anyone, but from the man she was beginning to trust. The same man who had already helped her more than she ever thought possible. Li Yuchen's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something calculating, something he didn't want Lian Ji to see. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But there's a price." Lian Ji felt a wave of confusion wash over her. Was this really happening? Was her life about to be completely reshaped by this man who had already turned it upside down? And what would this mean for her family, her mother, and the fragile hope she had been clinging to? The tension in the room was palpable as Li Yuchen turned to face her father, his words heavy. "I'll take care of the debts, but in return, I want something more. I want to know everything about your family, every secret, every hidden truth. Only then will you get what you need." Her father nodded, clearly desperate. "Anything." Lian Ji stood frozen, her mind racing. What was Li Yuchen really asking for? And more importantly, was she willing to let him into her family's deepest secrets? Her world was on the brink of shattering. But as she looked between the two men in her life, her father, who had abandoned her, and Li Yuchen, who was offering everything, she realized that the only way forward was to take a leap of faith. "Deal," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing. As her father left the apartment, Lian Ji turned to Li Yuchen. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of clarity. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to face it alone, whether or not she could trust him. She couldn't deny that for the first time in her life, someone had offered her a chance at something more, something real, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The door closed behind her father, and as the night settled around them, Lian Ji felt a glimmer of hope stirred deep within her. The story of sacrifice, loss, and betrayal wasn't over yet, but now she had someone in her corner, someone who would fight with her, no matter the cost. And, for the first time in a long while, that felt like a victory in itself.